Over the last several weeks throughout the season of Lent, which precedes this Easter Sunday, our congregation has been talking about 7 words that can promote change in our lives. The words we've looked at in worship have been things like yes and no, thanks and help, enough and sorry. And this morning on Easter Sunday, we come to our last word, which is appropriate for this morning. It is wow. This is a particularly apt word, as no one really expects the resurrection. If there was ever a time to utter a word of surprise, wonder, amazement, it is this morning. And on behalf of the church, I want to thank all of you for being here, especially our guests. And our hope is that you take some of this wow home with you today. It's a great feeling to be wowed by something. And there are all kinds of experiences that can elicit that feeling within us, or that word from our lips. As I was reading and preparing for this sermon on Monday, I was sitting in a coffee shop trying to recall those moments in my own life when that word was brought forth from my lips. I remember as a child, my parents took our family on a European vacation, and I must confess I did not absorb much. They essentially wasted an entire continent on an 8-year-old. But as I was writing my notes, I wrote the words, Notre Dame. Of all the things that we saw and experienced, for some reason that cathedral stuck in my little heart. The vastness of the space, the rows, windows, my dad teaching me who Marc Chagall was and about the stained glass windows that he had created. For some reason that holy and sacred place brought forth a wow from my little 8-year-old lips. As I left that coffee shop I was working in and saw the news about the fire at Notre Dame, another wow escaped my lips. One of sadness and disappointment, not knowing if my own children would ever get to see that amazing space, if they would have the opportunity to be wowed by it. But not every wow comes from ancient cathedrals that took 200 years to build. Some wows are much simpler, aren't they? As children, with that wonderful innocence, when everything is new, you're easy to be wowed. It's the circus, it's fireworks, it's seeing Disney World for the first time. Everything is a wonderful wow. As adults, we're a little harder to please. We're amazed by the vastness of the universe, seeing your bride or your groom for the first time in their wedding regalia, the birth of a baby or a grandchild. You know, this year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. Some of you remember being wowed by that. And we see it in nature, in a Grand Canyon, the immensity of California redwoods, a sunset, a dogwood in bloom if you don't have allergies, or just the wonder of Monte State Park here in our backyard. The struggle for us, though, is as we get older, we often lose that sense of wow. We've seen and experienced enough that we are harder to impress. Rather than enjoying the magician and the magic show, we're trying to figure out how that magic gets done. 90% of us sitting in that audience are just trying to ruin the wonder and the magic for ourselves. Figure it out. No, that's wires, mirrors, magnets. You're not magic. You're not a wizard. You know, there are 3 parts to a great magic trick that I learned from a movie that came out a few years ago called Prestige. The first is the pledge. The pledge is the magician takes out something ordinary, like a dove. Imagine there's a dove in my hand. Imagine I know how to do magic. Yes. And the magician lets you inspect it and look at it and go, oh, it is a bird, it has wings, it is alive, it is breathing, it is a bird. And then the second part is the turn. And that's where the magician makes that ordinary thing disappear. Imagine that the bird disappeared. Does something extraordinary. But the magic isn't done until the third part, which is called the prestige, and that's where the magician brings it back. Amazing, and the crowd roars and everyone's happy, and if I was really doing magic, you'd be much more pleased. But the hard part is that we try to figure it out. Finding the wonder again in the story that we've seen and experienced so many times over our lives. The more we see something, the more we try to figure out how it's done. Some of you worshiping with us this morning, I know, are semi-professional skeptics. I'm not naive. I know some of you are here under duress. I know you were dragged here by your families, and that's okay. If you're looking for the wires and the mirrors and the resurrection story, the good news is you're not the only one. The Romans, the religious leaders, even the witnesses are trying to figure out how to explain the unexplainable in the Sunday morning resurrection story. How can we read and believe this story and not be wowed by it? Because this isn't magic. This isn't a trick. There's no wires, there's no mirrors. Every Easter we are confronted with a choice as we join Mary and the disciples in peering into that empty tomb and trying to figure out what that means. Because we have a choice. Because everyone seems to agree on one thing. That they got to that tomb and they go, "We seem to have lost Jesus. Has anyone seen him? We don't know where he is." Thank you, Rain. Rain gets me. That's the important thing. The choice we have to ask is, how did it get that way? How did it get that way? Now, the Roman and Jewish officials have to release a statement to the people on why that tomb is empty. A report that explains why Jesus' body has gone missing. And the disciples and the women, as the day goes on, have a different story of exactly what happened. The question for us is, which one are we going to believe? So let's talk about the story that we know so well a little bit more deeply. On Friday, Jesus was crucified and died horribly on the cross. Now, because he died later in the afternoon, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he was hastily buried in a borrowed tomb because they needed to get him in the ground before the Sabbath began at sundown. The Roman and Jewish officials, in a rather stunning understanding of Jesus' own teaching, understand that Jesus had said that he was going to die and rise again on the third day. The disciples never figured that out, but somehow the Roman officials and Jewish officials knew. The powers that be cannot have dead men giving hope to revolutionaries. They may not believe that Jesus was able of rising from the dead, but they certainly believed that his followers could steal his body and incite some kind of riot and unrest. So they send guards to secure the tomb. Now, religious artwork usually shows 2 guards, because the plural of guards was 2, but most likely it would have been at least 4 or more guards there outside the tomb. You needed 4 guards for each of the 4 watches of the night so that one guard could rest while the other 3 watched. And these guards were not just sent to stand next to the tomb, next to the big rock that had been rolled in front. They were sent to seal the tomb. In Matthew's gospel, it says that they were sent to seal it. Now, what does that mean? This means that an iron bar was laid across the entrance, that clay seals were affixed on either end of that iron bar, with the Roman emperor's face stamped into those seals, as if to say, Caesar is watching you. Nobody is getting in, nobody is getting out. These are highly trained soldiers. They know that the penalty is death if a prisoner escapes, so if a dead body gets away, they're going to be in big trouble. But when you consider Jesus' followers, his disciples, the stories that we have read in the Gospels, you might say to yourself, this seems like overkill. Because the disciples are not known for their strength and their fortitude in the face of adversity. These are not men and women capable of an Ocean's 11-style grave-robbing heist. These are guys who, in the face of danger, run, scatter. You probably could have just had the big rock and a Roman soldier with a slingshot, and they would have said, we're good. And yet, despite all of these preparations, Jesus' body is missing the next day. Do you know what the official story that was released in the Jerusalem Times the next day was? These highly trained Roman guards, yes, all 4 or more of them, fell asleep. And the followers of Jesus whisked his body away. Yes, these former tax collectors and fishermen, in an as yet undiscovered ninja-like skill set, crept in among the sleeping guards, broke the clay seals, removed the iron bar, rolled the giant stone away, loaded up Jesus' body, all without so much as making a peep to wake the guards. And that's the history of peeps. If you didn't know, look it up. Okay, seems plausible, right? Seems plausible that somehow they would be able to do this. Or maybe, just maybe, something incredible happened. Something so unexpected, so unheard of, that the leaders had to make up something to explain it. They needed a cover story to explain the unexplainable, because you can't have people saying what really happened. Matthew's gospel says that Mary and the women approached the tomb and the earth quaked, that the guards shook and were like dead men. The details change a bit from gospel to gospel, but they all agree on one thing. Jesus' body isn't just gone. Jesus is alive. Jesus goes on and greets old friends like it's no big deal. He's like, "Hi, fellas, you got anything to eat?" He keeps showing up again and again and again to hundreds of people in the course of this Easter season that we are about to enter into. And they experience this amazing resurrected Savior. People that knew him, people that didn't. Now here's the wow for me in this story. Here's what makes me believe this wonder-filled, life and history-changing moment. It's not just the empty tomb. It's not just the accounts of the disciples. It's what came afterwards. The disciples and the apostles that came after them, they staked their lives on the story. You have to believe in something pretty strongly to give your entire life to it. They didn't return back to being fishermen. They didn't go back to being tax collectors. No, why on earth would they spend the rest of their lives telling the story of Jesus to any person who would hear it if it wasn't true? Someone would have broke. Someone would have confessed, "We made it all up. It was Thomas. He made us do it," because they blame Thomas for everything. But the disciples don't leave their faith in Jesus behind them. They double down on it. Thomas goes on to India and ends up being pierced by spears. Peter is crucified upside down, beheadings and crucifixions and beatings and flayings. The disciples' ends are not good. But 2-1, none of them recants. None of them confesses. None of them says, "It was all a lie. We made it up." What could possibly make you sacrifice? What could make you give your life away in this way if it wasn't true? Would you do any of that for a lie that someone made up? Who would endure the hardship and the difficulty of lives like that? You know, my life's pretty easy, but I've given 15 years of my life to ministry in Christ Church. I'm not interested in devoting my life to a lie. But I'll tell you what I will sacrifice for. I'll sacrifice for what I love, for what I believe to be true in the depth of my heart. I will sacrifice for the opportunities that exist for myself and others to experience this divine wow that we get to experience together as followers of Jesus Christ. Something happened 2,000 years ago. Everyone agrees on that. You can choose to believe it was a con, a trick, a manipulation, some kind of power play, but boy, it would have to be a long game, wouldn't it? Because power didn't come into the picture until the disciples were long gone. And friends, the church today, the majority of the body of Christ, we don't deal in power. Sure, there are some pastors and churches that wield and abuse power and authority. Sure, there are some churches that have enough money to make King Solomon blush. But most of those who follow Christ today don't relish in power. In fact, most of us endure and struggle because we believe. Because we believe. We worship and serve together and strive for justice in our world, all while struggling to make ends meet and doing the best we can to share the love of God with others. It's not easy. That's why a lot of pastors and church members quit, because it's just too hard. But every once in a while, we get to be reminded of why we do what we do, why we believe what we believe. We get to be reminded of the wow. on days like today, on Easter Sunday, and we know that we can see hope in the midst of darkness, even on a day like today that's been marred by violence half a world away. What we don't see in this moment is that God is still working. In the midst of the violence and the carnage, we don't know exactly what God is up to, but I guarantee you in the hours and days and weeks ahead, you will see what God can do. As we see people investing in the lives of those who have seen their lives destroyed. As we see people responding in prayer and love and support for people they do not know. As we see people in the church being the church. Those will be the moments when we will be able to look out at the world and once more say, wow, even in the darkness, God is still working. Praise be to God. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, we come into your midst on this Easter